Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which occurred in the late 5th century, was absolutely an age-defining moment. But what if it never happened? What would our past look like? What would our present look like from a linguistic, geopolitical, and technological standpoint? What would our reality be? To hypothesize an alternative history where the Roman Empire maintains itself as a solid political entity and does not collapse in 476 AD, as it actually did, we must necessarily seek those elements and critical moments in Roman history and reimagine them. The main triggering factor that weighs on a series of other criticalities within the empire, generating a succession of crises and a generalized collapse, is the expansionistic thrust of a new people towards the west, the Huns. A reality made up of warrior bands, probably of Ural Altaic origin. The Huns imposed themselves in critical mass in the steppes of Eurasia, magnetizing Turanian and Indo-Iranian elements, and then descend upon the Germanic world, giving rise to the phenomenon remembered as the barbarian invasion or migration period. Even today, we don't really know what pushed the Huns westward, whether it be the rise of a new charismatic war chief or the conflicts with the Mongolian reality. Perhaps it was a Rouran Khaganate that expelled them from East Asia, or maybe it was the failure of an attempt at invading the then very powerful Jin dynasty in China. In any case, let's remove the Han factor from the equation. In our alternative timeline, the Huns could have merged with the Rouran Khaganate or successfully overcome the Jin defenses, penetrating deep into China, or simply maybe they failed to produce a dynasty of warrior chiefs powerful enough to magnetize a critical mass of nomadic tribes of the steppe. Alternatively, they could have descended southward on the Sassanid Empire. Regardless of what we choose, the domino effect that influenced the steppes of Eurasia in the 4th century AD and that makes the pressure along the Rhine-Danube limes unsustainable never takes place. Now, as a result of this, we will not have the massive volume of Gothic refugees that were fleeing from the Huns and that historically were welcomed into the empire in 376 AD. And do keep in mind that these refugees will revolt against the empire, also because at this time the Roman Empire was incapable, because of the high level of corruption within their leaders, to both integrate them and absorb them in a manner that would be advantageous for the empire while maintaining social content. And because these Gothic refugees will remain in their seats north of the Danube, the Gothic War of 376 to 382, and in particular the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, will never occur, and that was a bitter defeat for the empire. Nor will the mass crossing of the Rhine on December 31st, 406, by the Vandals, Alans, Burgundians, Suebi, Quadi, and the Sarmatians. Similarly, not having to deploy a large number of troops on the continent to try to hold the Rhine-Danube limes, Britain would never have fallen into the hands of the Picts and Scots, and then of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Although certainly tense, relationships between Rome and the Barbaricum will not take that frantic and vertiginous turn that will materialize with the devastations and collapse of the 5th century AD. Lacking the disruptive and accelerating factor of the Huns, the relationships between Rome and the Germanic world managed to take a gentler turn. There is no shortage of moments of tension and conflict, of course, but the Roman cultural influence already exercised increasingly east of the Rhine and north of the Danube, starting from the 2nd century AD, has a way of taking deep root in the Barbaricum. Emperor Valens, whom, in our reality now, does not die at Adrianople, begins a cautious and measured policy aimed at intensifying relationships between the empire and the barbarians, particularly by favoring trade beyond the limes. While the Germanic aristocracy, particularly those of the Goths and the Franks, are Romanizing exponentially, on the right bank of the Rhine and left bank of the Danube, barbarian settlements arise with a marked commercial nature, closely linked to the military castra of the opposite bank, which soon become multi-ethnic centers and vectors from which Roman culture radiates towards the hinterland of the Barbaricum. At the same time, contingents of Germanic mercenaries are hired within the empire to serve with their policing function to quell the motions of the Bagaudae, the rebellious peasants who regularly rise up, particularly in Gaul and Spain, as a consequence of fiscal pressure. In this timeline, the Bagaudae emotions cannot take advantage of the climate of instability generated by the barbarian invasions, which have not taken place, and moreover, the increasingly normalized relationships with the Germanic world lead to a more contained military mobilization of the empire's population, which therefore weighs less heavily on the agricultural sector, making revolts less frequent and virulent. The Germanic mercenary bands that militate within the empire repressing peasant revolts come into even more contact with Romanity, and when they return to the lands of origin, not only are they laden with wealth, but they also become bearers of a cultural baggage that spreads and further diminishes the cultural gap between Romans and Germanic people. The policy of openness towards the Barbaricum is crowned with Theodosius, who begins to settle Germanic communities in the areas of highest political instability of the empire, in Gallia Lugdurensis, in Africa, in Britain, offering land donations to immigrants who arrive on a voluntary basis through imperial recruiters who draw directly from frontier villages. If the Germanic communities partly have the function of deterrent against peasant uprising and territorial control, Theodosius will also set them up as strong agricultural realities. The Germans receive as a gift plots of land that they will cultivate according to a soft form of colonatus, increasing the production of the empire, which, no longer being able to rely on the previous predatory economy, has the priority need to increase its internal production. The settlement of Germanic communities with both military and agricultural character is followed by a progressive use of machinery, particularly water mills, which increase the production of food resources. Now, speculatively, bellows and gear hammers appear, which give a boost to the metallurgical production, and we will probably start seeing an incremental usage of machinery within the sphere of production, even though it may be slow at first. But another thing that makes our alternative timeline interesting is what happens within the phenomenon of slavery, because we know that in the 3rd and 4th century the inflow of new slaves had diminished due to the fact that we have an overall lacking of new military campaigns. But in our timeline, we have a new phenomenon that now occurs. The Germanic frontier communities, thanks to the propulsive thrust generated by the mercenary chiefs returning from their militancy within the empire, have now constituted themselves into small kingdoms, which now conduct raids against the tribes of the barbarian hinterland, with the main purpose of acquiring slaves to then sell to the Romans. In Germania, a kingdom of the Franks, a kingdom of the Alemanni, and a kingdom of the Burgundians are now constituted. In the territories of today's Czech Republic and Slovakia, the kingdom of the Quadi and the Marcomanni prosper, heir to the ancient regnum Vaniarum, which, before all others, have become a profitable political and cultural relationship with the empire. In Dacia, or Dacia, up to the shores of the Black Sea towards the Crimea, several Gothic potentates have arisen, which are among the main suppliers of slaves to the empire. Now that we have had a general overall look at the dominant, the late empire, what would the Middle Ages look like? Well, here's the thing. I'd argue that after all of these events, there would be no medieval period at all. And what I mean by that is mostly speaking of nomenclature. Now, if you were to go to war, but you were given a chance to, wear a helmet, would you not choose to do so? Well, of course, I know I would. And you could say that the internet is indeed a battlefield, and unfortunately, a helmet is not the best defense. Still gonna wear it though. And you know what else is awesome? The kind sponsor that made this video possible, Private Internet Access. Whenever you are browsing online on an unprotected device, such as your phone, computer, tablet, console, your device is transmitting a great amount of information which can be viewed by various different entities. A virtual private network hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel and server infrastructure. This way, it shields your digital life from the eyes of those that are looking to exploit your private information. Thanks to Private Internet Access, you will also be able to utilize all sorts of websites and online features that would otherwise be limited or restricted depending on your physical location, including streaming services such as Netflix and Amazon Prime, which would have a different library and different titles depending on where you are. Watching Netflix without private internet access is like paying for a real Italian caffè espresso, but you only get a cup of water with sugar. So simply change the VPN to one of the 91 countries available and gain access. Private internet access is also available for all platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and with a single subscription you can protect an unlimited amount of devices. They never record or store user data, and their no-log policy has been proven multiple times in court, which is why I trust them. And this is also risk-free since there is a 30-day money-back guarantee and a 24/7 customer support. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below, and by doing so you will get an 83% off private internet access. That's just $2.03 a month, and you will also get 4 extra months completely for free. Massive thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring my video. Lacking the division brought by the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the characterizing element that would have marked, in the eyes of historians, the end of an era and the entry into a new age wouldn't of course be the fall of the empire, that never happened, but would have certainly become the affirmation of Christianity as the official religion. So rather than being the Middle Ages, it would be more coherent to call them the Christian Age, also taking into consideration the Edict of Thessalonica of 380 AD. In a Roman Empire devoid of the instability caused by barbarian invasions, where social disorder were increasingly contained, Christianity would not have resulted in an element of disturbance, but on the contrary, a factor of internal and external stabilization. Imperial power, finding a divine justification for its being, would have found itself less and less having to face the insurgents of usurpers nominated by the legions, and the widespread adherence to Christianity would have resulted in a further bonding agent with the Germanic frontier kingdoms. The same Germanic kingdoms that are now a sort of buffer zone between the empire and the inner Barbaricum. It is also very likely that now the Germanic kingdoms would have absolutely exploited this idea of utilizing faith as a pretext to begin new military campaigns of Christianization, particularly in the east within both other Germanic groups, but also Indo-Iranian tribes of the hinterland, then clashing with the new barbarian realities on the move in the 6th century AD, such as the Kutrigers, the Avars, and the Slavs. Probably having difficulty, the Romanized barbarian kingdoms would have requested imperial intervention, and thus the expansion of Christianity would have become the new propulsive element of the empire to further extend its influence beyond its borders, and probably indirectly increasing its political control over the barbarian world. Defeated, the nomads of the steppes would have returned eastward, while the Slavs, lacking Avar control after Christianization, would have been integrated into the expanding barbarian kingdoms, or would have ended up creating themselves into independent potentates in the territories that today correspond to Russia and Ukraine. Poland probably would have never been affected by a serious Slavic penetration, lacking the thrust that during the period of invasion had depopulated it of the Vandals, thus making it an easy land of conquest, and would have ended up reinventing itself as a bordered reality between the Romanized barbarian kingdoms and the Slavic world. Now, while Christianity, as it happened in our real history in the early medieval period, would have become a common denominator and also a sort of connecting political element, as I have explained on this dedicated video, which is called How Powerful Was the Church in the Medieval Period, you should totally check it out. I think in this situation, the progressive adherence to the religion of the people that you're supposed to enslave may have actually called for a sort of general decay of the concept of slavery, at least within this imperial context. In the meantime, technology would have then found a notable propulsion, and within a politically united and solid reality, such as the empire, its development would have been decidedly faster compared to what happened in the real Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. Machinery for agricultural and metallurgical use would have begun to spread exponentially, and to be produced in even better models. Mass production would have happened much earlier than did in our reality, while new fields would have finally enjoyed interest and intensive development, such as that of steam engines, already known in the 1st century AD in our timeline. Look up Heron's Aeolopile, although they were never developed due to lack of necessity. The new invasions of the 8th and 9th century, those of the Norsemen, Bulgars and Hungarians, would have found an incredibly solid Europe, and their impact would have probably been very relative. Perhaps in Eastern Europe, Bulgars and Hungarians would have managed to wedge themselves into the Gothic kingdoms and even to snatch lands from the empire, but they would have followed their historical parabola, quickly Christianizing and becoming part of the imperial koine on a cultural, if not political basis. The Norsemen, on the other hand, would probably have followed a very different development. If the concept of the Swedes in Russia and the Dano-Norwegians in Ireland and Scotland would have probably not have been very different from the ones we know, Roman Britain and the coasts of Gaul would have not been easy prey for the Vikings at all, because now they have imperial defense. So these Vikings, who then perhaps were in search of an outlet, would have projected themselves much earlier and with greater intensity towards the Atlantic routes. Iceland and Greenland would have been discovered perhaps over 100 years earlier than they have in our reality, and so would Helluland, Markland and Vinland, or the Canadian coasts of Baffinland, Labrador, and Newfoundland. All the series of raids against England culminating in the establishment of the Danelaw, and those directed against the French coasts, which would have led them in 845 and 885 to the two sieges of Paris by Ragnar or Rollo, and finally to the establishment of the Duchy of Normandy, would never have taken place, and the Viking crews would have poured into Canada, leading to the birth of one of more Norse kingdoms overseas. From these kingdoms, we have new explorers, and they would have probably sailed along the American coast, anticipating certain geographical knowledge by very much. The American discovery, even historically speaking, would be Viking. The importation of timber and further resources from Canada would have allowed the Greenlandic colony to prosper and not become extinct like it did, and the North Atlantic would have become the seat of a true Norse thalassocracy which, detached from Denmark and Norway, would probably have given rise to a sort of federal mercantile hegemony that would have included the coast of North America, Greenland, Iceland, Ireland, and the Scottish Isles. Now let's talk about Columbus, who by now is a subject of the Roman Empire. And he goes with a fleet, a Roman fleet now, directly from Italy, and he's moving into the Americas. Who does he find there? Does he find Native Americans because the Norse haven't expanded that far? Or is it all Norse? Well, that would be very interesting. But let's imagine for a moment the most plausible of the two. He still finds Native Americans. So now European powers are conquering America. But these are Italians. And America becomes the new empire, not the new world. This is of course probably the most speculative side of all, considering that there are so many variables that it's difficult to really continue to expand our lines, but perhaps I could make a dedicated video to what the new Roman American Empire would have looked like. If you're interested, let me know in the comments. Now, let's talk about Islam. If, in a different way, the Bulgarian, Magyar, and Norse raids would have taken place, perhaps we would not have had the terrible Saracen piracy in the Mediterranean. If, together with the affirmation of Christianity, we have the birth of Islam again, we cannot know how disruptive the Islamic expansion would have been, having to deal with a solid Roman Empire and not with a Byzantine Empire that had to constantly watch its northern borders from the interference of Slavs and steppes people. Even if some decisive battles, like the decisive clash of Yarmouk, fruit of the military genius of the Muslim leader Khalid ibn al-Walid, had been won by the Arabs, as happened, it is highly probable that the empire would have had a way to concentrate its efforts in the Near Eastern theater. Instead of witnessing a triumphal ride of Islamic forces throughout Syria and then all of North Africa to Spain, it is highly probable that the Near East would have turned into the theater of fierce clashes between Romans and Arab troops, with alternating events that would have led to a stalemate and ups and downs that would have followed one another over the century. In general, we could imagine, with the passing of centuries, that the Roman Empire would be taking the place, which, in the real timeline, was of the Holy Roman Empire, and then of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as the priority adversary of the Rashidun Caliphate, and subsequently as opponents to the Ottoman Empire. Now, there are of course a lot of other things that we could talk about. What about the Vatican and the Catholic Church? I mean, at the end of the day, that's pretty similar to what the Roman Empire really was. So perhaps there would be no division between the Vatican and the rest of Italy. It perhaps would be just one Christian empire, or even theocracy. But as we push an alternative history beyond a certain limit without dedicating hours and hours of historical analysis, it is difficult if one wants to remain credible and detailed. But starting from the assumption that in this alternative timeline the Roman Empire has never fallen, we can imagine that it would have entered into collaboration or conflict with the hypothetical Norse thalassocracy of the Atlantic for the domination of the Americas, perhaps dedicating itself to a colonization of Central and South America as Spain and Portugal did in real time. It is also likely to imagine the empire pushing into colonial operations towards Africa. Finally, lacking the political opposition between Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire, Christianity would have never gone through the Great Schism of 1054, and Russia, born as in the real timeline from the superimposition of Swedish and Slavic elements by influence of Rome, would have converted to a Christianity that remained unitary and never divided between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, thus increasing the cultural proximity between the West and Eurasia. Alright, all of this is extremely interesting and perhaps even impressive in a way. But what would have happened when it comes to the language. Because we know that in the 5th century there was a gradual decrease in the usage of Latin, which used to be the language of communication, the common language, if you will, among many people in many different countries and realities. And then we have instead the birth of the Romance languages and in general the common vernacular. You've got French, you've got Spanish, you've got Italian, and then of course English becomes the common language in our timeline. But what about our speculative timeline? What would have happened to Latin if the empire had never fallen, and how would we be speaking today? The greater political cohesion given by the subsistence of the imperial reality would have favored greater linguistic homogeneity in much of Europe. Instead of Italian, French, Spanish and Portuguese, we would have had regional variants of Latin instead, as well as in England, which would have continued to be called Britannia. English would not exist. The different variants of Latin would have ended up acquiring terms from Germanic languages, of course, brought by colonists and mercenaries, probably words related to the agricultural and military sphere, while in the same way the Germanic dialects of the frontier, barbarian kingdom, would have been enriched with words of Latin and Greek origins related to the sphere of commerce, science, technology and military. Greek would have remained a learnt language in the western part of the empire, while in the eastern part it would have been the most widely spread idiom. The Slavic languages would never have spread in Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Slovenia, which would have remained Illyricum instead. They would have spoken yet another variant of Latin, and possibly in their more peripheral valleys, perhaps they would have continued to speak that Illyrian dialect, which is the ancestor of today's Albanian. Now, of course, even at the time of Dante, when the current Italian language starts to be created in a way, Latin was still used. It was still the language of the learned. So it's not difficult to imagine that if the empire never fell, Latin would have just remained. Of course, it would have evolved. The Latin spoken by someone in the 15th century of this alternative timeline would still be very different and a lot more modern than the Latin spoken by Julius Caesar, for example, but still it would be Latin, and I would be more than happy to actually call it Neo-Latin. Now, the term Neo-Latin has actually been used, and it's usually the sort of Latin that people in the Italian Renaissance are trying to pick up and study and use again. This is what we usually refer to when we say Neo-Latin, but in our timeline, Neo-Latin is actually the real descendant of Latin, and it is so close to the original language that perhaps it could be something a little closer to Northern Sardinian dialect, for example, which is, as of today, the closest language to classical Latin. Therefore, instead of speaking English now, I would probably be speaking the, I imagine, Britannic version of Latin, while if you, as a watcher, considering the percentages in my analytics, are from America, you would be speaking the American version of Latin, which perhaps we could call New World Latin. For now, as a speculative beginning of trying to think what would the world look like if the Roman Empire never fall, I think that this is good as an introductory subject and initial video. But if you like this series and it goes well, please share it, leave a comment, leave a like, and who knows, perhaps I could continue. Maybe we could jump into, but what would military would have looked like in the Middle Ages with a medieval Roman Empire? What would the armor and weapons have evolved as? And we could talk about that, or maybe policies and politics. That could be very interesting to see. And what sort of development would we have had? Would there have been a Second World War? Would it have happened in the 1600s? Would they already have tanks back then because of the, development? And when would the first flying machine have been invented? Well, all of this is really interesting, but maybe we can make this into a series. Of course, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to take advantage of the amazing offer Private Internet Access has for you by clicking the link in the description below. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.